Joining us now is retired U.S. Army Colonel, Medal of Honor recipient, and NBC News military analyst Jack Jacobs. Colonel, according to Ukraine's largest energy company, DTEK, this is the 13th attack this year on the country's infrastructure. You know, we saw Kharkiv, which is a city of 500,000 people, just completely in the cold and the dark on this holiday. What is your take on these infrastructure strikes? Obviously, there is some military aspect to it, but do you think there's also psychological warfare at play?
Well, we have to go back to the beginning of the war. You remember that the Russians decided that they were going to attack strong points in Ukrainians' defense. They brought a large column of armor in the north to try to attack Kyiv. That didn't work. These are old tactics that didn't work in this modern environment with technological improvements and the ability to attacking vehicles like tanks. So that didn't work. The result of that was kind of a stalemate on the battlefield, with local attacks being successful, but strategic success for the Russians being difficult to achieve. And we've seen the war go on for a long period of time with no strategic success on the part of the Russians, who expected the Ukrainians to capitulate fairly clearly. What's happened now is that Russia has decided that it's going to attack the kinds of things that may bring it results ultimately, and that is to attack infrastructure and civilian targets. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that they expect or hope that the Ukrainians will eventually give up under the onslaught of the type that you're talking about. But the second is the perception that the support from the West will ultimately wane and disappear. Don't forget that we have a relatively isolationist government that's going to take charge in January in the United States. An administration that has already said that it does not think that it needs to support Ukraine in its defense against the Russians. And what Russia's hoping is that it will be able to keep the Ukrainians at bay long enough for a new administration to decide it's not going to support Ukraine. Christina.
Yeah, I was just at the G7 in Italy with Secretary of State Blinken, and I know that was a big focus of that meeting as European leaders, you know, have coalesced around this enthusiastic U.S. support of Ukraine. And without that, there's a fear that those coalitions may not be as stable. I also want to ask you, since fall of this year, at least 10,000 North Korean troops have joined Russia's war with Ukraine on the battlefield. And now, according to the New York Times, U.S. officials are saying it was actually North Korea's idea to join the fight, appearing to hope Russia will repay the favor in the future. So I'm wondering, what do you think Kim Jong-un is hoping to gain? And is this a reflection of the fact that China, which had long supported North Korea as kind of a client state, is dialing back its support, and they need to look other places for the things they need to run their government?
Yeah, I think all that's correct. Original response was, well, the Russians need troops, and so they're going to ask the North Koreans for assistance. North Koreans sent about 10,000 troops, a lot of them special operations forces, to assist the Russians. But the Russians have a nearly unending stream of conscripts to support their attacks in Ukraine, and so the conclusion perhaps was wrong. The information now is that the North Koreans asked to be involved. And there are a couple of reasons for that, some good explanations. The first is, as you suggest, Korea would really like to have some assistance. It's desperately in need of assistance, economic. Well, it's not going to get any political assistance, but economic assistance. And while it appears that there have been no concrete agreements that have been made, the perception is that the North Koreans will be able to ask the Russians for help, particularly hard currency help down the road. But there's another military reason why the North Koreans would want to be involved. Don't forget that the last time the North Koreans have been actively involved in ground combat was in 1953. So they've had several generations of North Koreans that have not participated in war, do not have any experience fighting, and the North Koreans perceive that they need that kind of experience to get institutionalized in the North Korean army and need to do it quickly. And thus, they've sent about 10,000 people to assist Russia. it's not clear whether or not any of the lessons that they need to learn about land combat in the modern sense are going to be learned in Ukraine. But that's what they're up to, and they're prepared to send even more troops there. Don't forget that North Korea devotes about 40% of its gross domestic product to defense. It's desperately in need of assistance, and like you suggest, assistance they can get in the future from Russia, Christina.
Yeah, they're also sending artillery shells, which have been in short supply. And I remember asking a U.S. official, how good are these shells? And the official responded, well, I wouldn't want to fire one. I also want to ask you, the Kremlin says there has not been any contact with President-elect Trump or future U.S. Special Envoy Keith Kellogg. But Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told reporters earlier today that Russia is willing to work with the Trump administration. What do you foresee the U.S.-Russia relationship looking like under a Trump presidency?
Well, we brought up the first thing that it's in Russia's mind, and that is to get some sort of a settlement in Ukraine. I think it was Henry Kissinger who, at the beginning of the war there, suggested that there would be a negotiated settlement ultimately, because there wouldn't be any battlefield success, that Russia would agree to withdraw its forces as long as it kept the Donbass and kept Crimea, and would forego its perception that what it really wanted was a land bridge to Moldova. There's a lot of agreement that that's what Russia's after. And that's going to be the initial arrangement. That's going to be the initial contact and objective when the new administration talks with Russia, that there'll be a negotiated settlement to the end of the war, and that's going to be the result. It remains to be seen whether or not it will go farther than that. I mean, Trump has already expressed admiration for Putin and the way he does things. But there are lots of things that are attendant to that. Once that is accomplished, if there is a ceasefire, don't forget that there are enormous economic and political problems inside Europe, all of Europe, not just NATO. And those need to be resolved. In an environment in which Russia is expansionist, there's a great deal of fear on the continent of Europe that the United States is going to be abandoning them to their fate 3,000 miles away. That's something that the State Department, the new State Department, is going to have to work really hard to alleviate those fears. Okay. Because don't forget, we have a great deal of economic interest in Europe, and that needs to be taken care of, Christina.
All right, a lot to keep an eye on. Colonel Jack Jacobs, thank you so much.
Right.